hello, everyone, and welcome to the musical Innertube. I am decaying Don Rooney.
And I'm the late John Timpane. You know, when he was alive, Don had quite a career in radio and television. He was an air personality, a news anchor, even a TV weatherman.
And dear departed John was a college professor. He was the ghostwriter of several books, and he was an editor and features writer at the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper.
Before the curse hit us, we teamed up for a radio show in college. On one show, we introduced a soothing musical interlude.
But that damned curse made it come out Musical Innertube.
And that became the name for this frightening podcast, where we talk with interesting people about their interesting lives.
And our guest today is Cory Hutcheson, who is an assistant professor of English at Kutztown University in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. And Cory is also an expert on folklore and has had books published and articles published on folklore. Welcome to the Musical Innertube, Cory.
Thanks so much for having me back. I'm glad to be here.
Let's start by talking about Halloween and all of the spooks and all that. My basic understanding of it is Halloween is All Hallows Eve before All Saints Day. But why does it concentrate on spooky, grisly dead people as opposed to the saints, which come up the next morning?
Well, I mean, because you know, it's the sort of like a party Saturday night, go to church on Sunday morning, right? Yeah, I mean, you think about that kind of historically. It really is. You're moving into what we sort of think of as like a dark time of the year, right? The light balance is shifting. The nights are longer than the days because we pass the autumn equinox, right? And so we derive this concept of Halloween largely from some what we'd call kind of pan-Celtic sources, these sort of Irish or sort of Gaelic-speaking cultures as well, but with influences from everything from Rome to the sort of papal authority and things like that sort of change it over time. But going way, way, way back, when you shift into this dark time of the year, there's real fear, right? Real fear that if the nights are getting longer, the spooky stuff that's out there in the shadows, the dark is that's sort of hiding all the monsters and the beasties, right? You want to do something to make sure that stuff can't get you. And so having a holiday, particularly a holiday right around this time of the year, that sort of recognizes this sort of spooky side of things and lets you revel in that a little bit, lets you go out and sort of celebrate it and play with the scary stuff. Gives you a chance to kind of it's sort of like the purge, right? You get a chance to kind of get this out of your system, and then you can move into this sort of season where you're moving into, for example, All Saints Day, All Souls Day. You're sort of remembering the dead, and that's another side of this, right? Is that you have this memorial for the dead that's happening right there too, and then kind of start slowly edging your way into the winter holiday season as well. So yeah, it really does derive from this sort of concept of like darkness is getting bigger, and what are we going to do about it?
What is interesting about it, and I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about it, is that in some ways we've injected a little bit of comedy into it, right? And sort of family pleasure. I mean, people throw holiday parties at Halloween now. They festoon their houses more than they ever did before. So I'm just wondering about, how that factors in, of making it this enormous party and kids going door to door with candy. It seems to have really, it's both very American, but also very human.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's you kind of hit on everything there, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff that's kind of happening. Because it used to be there was this concept of, it wasn't quite trick or treating, but it was called going a souling or begging a soul cake, where young people might go from door to door, oftentimes kind of more during the Christmas season, although it could happen anytime, kind of in the dark time of the year, and they would sort of go door to door. and sing a little song and be given these things that are called soul cakes, which are sort of like, you just think of them as like little pastries, right? And so this getting sweet treats by going door to door. That's common enough. We see that in kind of British history or English history there. And we see variations of that all throughout kind of European culture and civilization as well. And so that's kind of existing on its own. Then you have, like we said, this sort of festival in this dark time of the year. There is this sort of jolly misrule thing happening, where once you start putting on a costume, right? Um, no one knows who you are now. So what you do may not come back to haunt you in the same way as it might other times of the year. And we see the same kind of thing happening at different times too. So Carnival has a similar kind of feel to it, where it's very wild and a little debauched at times, right? And this is how you get people. Now they're dressing up as what I think I saw a costume that was like sexy corn recently. So, an ear of corn with like nice legs, basically.
Well, okay.
So, but yeah, there's this, and there's also, and I should say, there is this kind of flirty, fun, not quite romance, but certain feelings are in the air. And you think about people doing apple bobbings, right? Apple bobbings are snap apple games where they're, young couples are trying to get each other's apples so they can get a kiss, or they're each diving at this apple that's being dangled in the air, in the chance they're going to wind up kissing a potential sweetheart. So there's always been that kind of flirty side to Halloween too.
The moment you put on a mask, the rules change. You might be recognized, you might not. A lot of the time, like at Halloween parties, people want to see what you're going to dress up as, and for the entertainment value, right?
Yeah.
But also you go from door to door, and maybe in neighborhoods that people don't know you, and now suddenly, well, they don't know who these people are, and so there's sort of this funny, almost like a procession that moves, up and down your front steps.
Yeah. That very much ties into, I mean, if you look kind of at the lore behind some of this, right? This idea that people are kind of, the word procession is such a good one there, because that's kind of one of the reasons people are dressing up at all, is because they were trying to hide themselves in plain sight from potentially strange creatures that might be wandering in the night, these sort of procession of the dead that might be making their way through the land on these kind of very sensitive nights right before All Souls Day or something like that. So, if you dress like one of the dead, right, then they're not going to harass you because you're one of them. And so there is that sense of, you don't know who's showing up at your door. And going back even into, a lot of kind of ancient cultures, there's this concept of what we call hospitality, right? This what we refer to as that. But it was something that was in ancient Greece, they called it the guest-host relationship. And the idea is, if somebody shows up at your door, you are obligated in some way to help them out. That you don't know when you're entertaining angels unaware, right? Or gods unaware. And we see lots of ancient stories that deal with this idea. So if, in this situation, it's more like devils unaware, right? And you don't know what these devils could do if you don't, give them a Hershey bar and send them on their way, right? So you want to take care of that problem, nip that in the bud. Because of course the other side of Halloween, and I hope we'll get into this. Sure, you got the treats, but you also got the tricks, right?
Well, I would think also that being masked would mean that when somebody eggs your car or your house, nobody knows who you are.
For sure.
Yes. Or toilet papers your house, which happened to me a few times. This sort of destruction that's not really destruction. It's symbolic destruction. It doesn't really destroy anything, but it certainly is a mess.
Yeah, it's an inconvenience more than a real hazard, right?
This is
it. Yeah. Well, where does the whole idea of trick or treat come in? Where did the trick part come in, and does that have any basis in folklore or legend?
Sure. I mean, yes, it all is kind of, it's a kind of intersection of a few different things happening there, right? So, yes, if you've got people kind of going a souling, right? You've got people going out and collecting treats. If they're being masked, if they're being guised, if they're hidden behind something, then they also have the opportunity to enact retribution if you don't show generosity or hospitality, right? This is the expectation. And if you won't abide by that, then there has to be a consequence for that. And so we see, there are these kind of traditions of doing these kind of elaborate pranks as a component of, if not the holiday itself, sometimes the night right before it. So you have, for example, in Detroit, you have Devil's Night, or in New Jersey, Philadelphia area, you've got what's called Mischief Night.
Mischief Night, absolutely.
I mean, it depends kind of on where you are. Sometimes it's the flaming bag of dog poop on your doorstep, right? And sometimes it can be vandalism. It can be acts of going out and vandalizing a piece of public property, spray painting it, dumping a bucket of paint on it, or um, wrapping it in sheets and stuff like that. It kind of depends on what people are. What's going on sort of in the world around them at that time. So, for example, if there's a lot of kind of uproar, controversy over certain figures that maybe there's a statue of in the town, right? That statue is going to be very, very quickly targeted on something like Mischief Night, because there's not likely to be retribution for that, and you can really go after it. Whereas, if there's not that kind of controversy sort of in the air, then they might sort of target a local political figure or authority figure. The kids are going to target the school principal, right, and go egg the house or run toilet paper all over the trees, things like that.
Devil's Night in Detroit, especially, is what when you say Devil's Night, that's the city that comes to mind. And there was a lot of fire and destruction and wanton vandalism on that. What was the idea behind that, specifically in Detroit, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, well, one, the fires are pretty normal. So you would oftentimes have. I mean, we have the jack-o'-lanterns, right? So there's a light. That you put out for the dead to guide their way. And bonfires were a pretty common part of this holiday for a long time too, where you'd go out and you build a big bonfire on a hill or something like that. So in a way, the fires in Detroit kind of are similar to this. And sometimes those fires, sometimes that gets oversold a little bit. People sort of think that, all of Detroit is on fire on October 30th, and it's not. It's just, it doesn't burn down every year, right? It's just, this is one form of vandalism. People will light things on fire. There are arsons occasionally. Sometimes they're just kind of out of control yard fires, right?
Let's talk about this idea that you mentioned earlier about kind of letting go prior to a very religious time of year, I guess, with the All Souls Day. And then we had, for those who are religious, into Advent and eventually Christmas. This would be like the last night to go nuts, I guess, sort of like Ash Wednesday or Shrove Tuesday sort of situation. Because we're talking about people vandalizing. We're talking about people, like you said, getting a little sexy and getting a little out of control. Is that sort of the idea behind this, that everybody's getting a little out of control?
To an extent, yeah, absolutely. There is a feeling of, especially if you are following the liturgical calendar, right? Then you're going to be moving into this period where you have All Souls Day, All Saints Day. There's going to be kind of a period of memorializing the dead. Eventually, you're going to be kind of making your way into the Advent season and the Christmas season, and there's hope, at least from I think the church's standpoint, that you'll engage in acts of piety. Now, we know from history that for most of the existence of things like Christmas, piety very rarely entered into the equation. It was a pretty
Yeah.
bawdy holiday.
Yes.
Really, that's the other thing, is like any time you can have a holiday where people can just let loose a little bit, they'll find a way to let loose. And so Halloween is just another iteration of that, I think. But then, there's also, if you're thinking about it kind of from a folkloric standpoint and a sort of mythological standpoint, one of the other things that's happening a lot at this time of year, if you're thinking back to agricultural times, farming communities and things like that, this is around the time of year also where, if you're going to be slaughtering any livestock that are going to be salted, smoked, put up for the winter to see you through until next spring when your new livestock gets born, this is around when it's going to have to happen. And if you're doing that, not to be too graphic, but there's going to be some blood involved, right? There's a lot of blood kind of happening through the sort of animal slaughter that has to happen there. And there's a real belief that if you have that much blood around, it's going to attract things that like that kind of violence, that like that kind of bloodiness. And so this is an opportunity to kind of give all of that a night to sort of explode. and hope that that satisfies whatever it is that's out there that's interested in all of this, and then you can kind of move into the rest of the year without that sort of fear that that's going to influence you. So there is an element of that going on too.
Yeah, and I was going to say agriculture does take a pretty prominent place in the holiday because we've got scarecrows, we've got pumpkins carved, we've got uh, shocks of wheat and corn as decorations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're putting so many kind of harvest festival trappings and trimmings and tropes up at this time of year. Scarecrows are a really good example, and scarecrows are great because they sort of embody this like very useful, very important part of the agricultural life, but also there, if you bump into a scarecrow in the middle of a field at night in a time where you don't have electric lamps all around, it's a scary
Yeah,
experience. um,
especially if it says hi.
right. Yeah. If it starts talking back, then you have a problem. And
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons that you want to be careful, right? Is on these nights if something like that happens. But yeah, you do also have like, pumpkins are fun because we associate them with Halloween. They're a New World crop. They're from here. If you would gone back to, for example, Ireland, where, the jack-o'-lantern tradition supposedly has its origins, they're carving a turnip over there, right? So it's a very different animal, but they are these kind of agricultural products that are being repurposed into part of the festivity.
We'll have more with Cory in a moment, but first, this soothing musical Innertube.
Cory's expertise on folklore has led him to write chapters in the Oxford Handbook of American Folklore and Folklife, and an encyclopedia that's entitled American Myths, Legends, and Tall Tales.
Cory has a book that was published in April called New World Witchery, a trove of North American folk magic. It's about North American folk belief in things like treasure hunting magicians, witches, and the traditions that color our holidays.
It's available on Amazon, including a Kindle version, at Walmart, your favorite bookstore, and wherever books are sold.
And now, more holiday folklore with Cory Hutcheson. Cory, how does our celebration compare to El Dia de los Muertos? In tone and in what people are doing.
Dramatically different, very, very different holidays. They're people make the mistake of thinking Dia de Muertos is basically Mexican Halloween, and it's not. It's a totally different kind of approach. It's not about placating the ghoulies and the goblins that are out there wandering in the night. It's not about trick or treating or anything like that. It's very much about family unity and heritage. There is the one connection is that in both situations you may have the presence of the dead, right? The idea that people who've died over the past year, this is their time to be honored and celebrated. And from the one side, on All Hallows Eve, Halloween, it's the sense of you want to make sure that the dead who are passing through your town to find their home on All Souls Day, or to find wherever they're going to go for that, have lights to light their way, right? And if they stop by, you give them something to help them on their journey. So there's that element. But beyond that, I mean, the Dia de Muertos, I mean, they're putting up these ofrendas that are specifically honoring multiple generations of their family. This is a time when the family is coming back to visit with them, spend time with them. They're making these lovely offerings to the dead. They'll go have picnics in the graveyards. It's very much focused on like light, marigolds, flowers, things like that, bright colors. Very, very sort of festive and happy and joyful celebration. Whereas I think Halloween kind of revels more in the sort of spooky side of things.
The picnic at the graveyard, which is something Americans used to do through the 19th century. They used to, every Sunday you'd have a family picnic, by the grave of your grandfather and grandmother. It was especially, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was especially strong among pioneer families, who did it all across the Midwest for many years. And you'd have crowds of people on a Sunday, just sitting down and throwing out the blankets and setting down their picnic baskets. But we don't do that anymore. It's interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, really, the whole graveyard picnic among what we sort of think of sort of the European American traditions, right? Um, that really hits its stride during the sort of Victorian era, where people are, like you said, they're going out to they'll try to kind of find whatever their oldest relative is, that's very close to them, and they'll go spend some time there with that, at that relative's grave, having a picnic. And part of the reason is because it's some of the public green space that's available during the Industrial Revolution era,
That's such a
right?
great point. I hadn't thought about that. So these are
Right, like,
citified people who
yeah.
want to they have nostalgia for the Welt.
Yes. Yes, exactly, right. It's sort of like, well, we don't have Central Park, right? We don't have like all these kind of beautiful green, trees and tree-lined, avenues and boulevards and things like that. So what do we have? Okay, well, we've got, Grandpa Smith, who's buried out there and has a patch of grass that we can sit on. And they'll put, we can bring flowers and make it look prettier. We can have a bench out there where we can all sit and share stories or play games and have, have a little food and things like that.
I know media has something to do with it because horror movies have to exist in some sort of a little encapsulated area. But when did it turn from honoring the dead or showing dead the way, as you talked about the jack-o'-lanterns, to actually fearing the dead, or the dead coming for us or trying to get us, or zombies or whatever else there is?
I mean, I think that the fear of the dead has been the longer impulse. As much as we want to, honor the dead and respect the dead, there's always this sort of fear of, I mean, death is the great unknown, right? It's the adventure, the great adventure that no one comes back from. Or at least, for a lot of people, that's how it feels. And so that fear of what could happen, I think that is the older impulse. And we see that sort of borne out by, folk tales that have to do with people being out on Halloween night and being misled by, corpses that will suddenly jump on their back and cling to them and lead them on these strange journeys and things like that. There's an Irish folk tale that is all about that. And so we see these kind of older stories and older legends, where that sort of the fear of what the dead can do, what they can oblige you to do, what happens if you get caught by the dead, or in some cases you have and I don't want to draw too close of a connection between these two things, but the fairy world, and the dead. So you have stories of, and here I should say, I'm not talking about Tinkerbell. I'm not talking about the Disney version. I'm talking about these kind of like
Not fun fairies.
No, these are strange otherworldly creatures, as big as you or me, that will go out on what they call these fairy raids, these riding processions. Halloween is one of the nights when they're thought to do that, and they might collect any mortals that they run into on their way, right? So again, and there is, in some places, there is an association of the dead being brought to the realm of the fairy, so that there's a little bit of overlap there. But whatever the case, something scary is out there on these nights, and so that impulse to kind of be afraid and sort of shy away from that, or mask yourself so that they can't find you, they don't know that you're not really one of them. That I think is the older impulse of the two.
I mean, it's superbly evoked in Washington Irving's Legend of Ichabod Crane. And there's pumpkins involved there too, where there's this bridge that if you're being chased by a fearsome spirit, if you can get there and cross the bridge before it gets to you, you will be protected from the advance of the spirit. And alas, for poor Ichabod, he doesn't make it. And
well, yeah, depending on how you read the ending of that story, because there's definitely a sort of hint that he may have just run off, right?
Right, exactly. Yes, there is that little speculation that, well, maybe it wasn't true what I just told you.
Right. Well, and that comes back to this. The reason it's the bridge in that story is because it crosses water, and there is a folk belief that if you can cross running water, not just like jump over a puddle, but if you can cross running water, that will confuse any evil spirits that are on your track, right? They get distracted and they can't continue on after you.
In the case of Ichabod Crane, that's a Knickerbocker thing from New York. That's a Dutch. You talked about the Celtic thing of having jack-o'-lanterns. Is there any reason why those sort of countries are contributed most to our Halloween traditions?
I mean, they were some of the most influential in terms of kind of early settlement of this sort of New England, Mid-Atlantic area, and so they're one of the basically they're some of the groups that we kind of turn to. If we're of European American heritage, they're some of the groups that we sort of turn to and look at and say, oh, well, that's where we're coming from. But that being said, you shouldn't discount the presence of, for example, the Welsh, right? The Welsh are a very big part of the Pennsylvania coal country. You have the French kind of moving from the Acadian region up in France and coming down to New Orleans and stuff like that. So they're adding some influences. There's all kinds of influences going on there. But why these countries? There's some discussion of this, but I feel like it's a little speculative. But I think it's maybe worth at least considering. If you're talking about places like Scotland and England and the Scandinavian countries and Holland and places like that, those are all kind of Northern European countries, which means that when winter in the dark time of the year set in, they get a lot more of it. They get a lot more darkness than other places might. So they're going to be maybe a little more likely to start telling some of these spooky, scary stories, or having some more, things that are going bump in the night in their world. But that's not to say that if you went down to Italy, you wouldn't find stuff too. You absolutely will. It's just maybe there's a little bit more being generated in some of these places where the night's a little longer.
We would be amiss if we didn't at least meditate for just a moment on the explosive growth of Halloween in the United States in the last 10 to 20 years. You see it in a lot of different ways. First of all, starting in September, pumpkin spice is everyone's flavor for everything. And that is somewhat recent, where it's a holiday themed flavor. It's a pumpkin flavor. It's connected to Halloween, but also, house decoration. Costumes are really advanced now. It used to be you made your own. I remember when we did back in the late 50s, early 60s, we made our own costumes.
Punch out a couple eye holes in a paper plate and call it a day, right?
Yeah, I used to smear Vaseline on my face and put coffee grounds on it and go out as a hobo, right?
As a hobo, yeah.
But I'm wondering, when you think about these ancient, the confluences of ancient cultures that we see in these traditions, now here comes along our commercial culture. This is an established sort of 2-3 month season, including every year new scary movies, right? New Halloween films. What does that make you think about?
Well, I mean, I think that some of this stuff goes in cycles. I mean, I think when you push back, like you were saying, if we push back into the 50s and the 60s, there was a little bit of a boom in Halloween then too, which also coincided with, kind of a boom in the interest in the occult, right? So you had films like Rosemary's Baby, you had The Exorcist, things like that coming out. Ouija boards were quite a popular gift there for a minute. And so you have these little boom and bust cycles. And I think, when you came through the 80s into the 90s, there was a very kind of corporate sort of mentality. There was a definite sort of it was just a different sort of feeling. So yeah, Halloween's still there, but it was kind of it was kid stuff at that point. You have some of the sort of sillier, goofier movies coming out that have to do with Halloween. So I think like Hocus Pocus there, right? Or even Nightmare Before Christmas, which is kind of this fun send up of like multiple holidays at once. But then you move into, like you said, you start moving into the early 2000s, and things do start to really shift. We do have a renewed fascination with kind of darkness, and I don't want to draw too fine a point on it, but around 2001, we had some very serious dark times, dark nights of the soul, right? Sort of as a nation, and if we're looking for a place to exercise that a little bit, to sort of put that out there and deal with the sort of metaphorical psychology of all that. And I'm not a psychologist. I shouldn't make too much of this, but it really does seem like we're so afraid all of a sudden. We're experiencing fear in a new way. That this sort of cycle of let's have more horror movies, let's have more Halloween, let's have more sort of, again, the fascination with the occult has kind of come back into vogue, right? And so let's have more of that so that we can have a place to put it all. We can have a place to place all this. And I also really like that you mentioned pumpkin spice, and I know that's not the scary part of the season, but I really like that because it's so, one of the things, it gets a lot of flack. I know there are a lot of people who sort of like take their jabs at pumpkin spice, but one of the things that's so neat about it is it really is rooted in sort of North America, right? You don't pumpkins are a North American. That's where they grow. That's where they come from. And so it's kind of our way of sort of staking a claim around that. You're not, if you go to Italy, if you go to Sweden, right, this season isn't all that huge to them. In England, it's a little bit bigger. Ireland, there's some interest in it, but really it's here. This is where we've made kind of our stand about it. And so I kind of love that we've sort of staked our claim and said, this is really important to us. And we're going to celebrate this, with, and maybe not quite as much panache and fanfare as we do the Yuletide season, but getting pretty close. And I think that's kind of neat.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for being with us today, Cory. We're going to lift a glass of pumpkin spice latte and maybe toast up a couple of pumpkin spice Pop-Tarts.
Excellent.
In celebration of Halloween. Thanks again for being here with us and talking about this weird, wacky, wonderful holiday.
Fascinating. Thanks again, Cory.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
You can get in touch with us by email. We're at musicalinnertube, that's all one word, @gmail.com.
You can follow us on Twitter at @MInnertube, capitalize the M and I.
Our webpage is Musical Innertube, musical spelled with 2 A's, .libsyn spelled LIBSYN.com.
The Innertube is available on Amazon Music, Facebook, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio podcasts, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Like us, why don't you? And give us a good review on any of those platforms.